Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There was once another god in the Imperium, not in the laughing, mad pantheon of chaos, not in the crumbling halls of the Old Ones, nor the distant myths of Xeno's archives. This was something else, a being of light not born from torment, but remembrance. A god who whispered comfort into the minds of the dying, who kindled hope in shattered psyches. And then, one day, it was gone. Not killed, not defeated, but erased. Not a trace in text, not a shrine in ruins, not even a heresy left to condemn. Just the silence of a wound you can't remember receiving, and the ache of something warm that never existed. The Inquisition has done many things in the name of survival: exterminatus, assassination, repression. But this was the great unmaking, the redaction of divinity, the killing of a god not through war but through forgetting. A cleansing so absolute that even history itself weeps in the corners of dreams. This is the story they don't want told. The tale of the god that mercy forgot. In the Imperium of man, gods are not merely worshipped, they are constructed, reforged, and weaponized. Divinity is a malleable currency, forged in the crucible of belief, reinforced by state dogma, and burned into the minds of billions through relentless devotion. But unlike the monolithic pantheons of old Earth, or even the shifting pantheon of chaos, the gods of the Imperium are a fragile and paradoxical thing. At its cold, paradox-wrapped heart lies the Emperor of mankind, a being many believe to be a god, yet who himself denied godhood. His ascension into divinity came not through his own will, but through the desperation of his children. When the age of apostasy solidified the ecclesiarchy's power, the idea of the emperor as the one true god became as unassailable as the stars themselves. His godhood is law, not choice. To question it is to die. To disbelieve is to be purged. Beyond the emperor, the chaos gods lurk as the only other beings universally recognized as divine across the galaxy. Beings of raw warp stuff, fed by emotion, given shape by collective trauma and psychic resonance. They are not worshipped by accident. They are the direct consequence of the warp's nature, emergent entities growing fat on suffering, war, pleasure, decay, and ambition. And yet, even they are not omnipotent. They are products of the minds that believe in them, as much prisoners as they are masters. What then is a god in this universe? It is belief made real. It is a wound in the warp that bleeds emotion and thought until the echo becomes a voice, the voice becomes will, and the will becomes divine. It is not an eternal truth, but a consensus hallucination strong enough to bend reality, which makes them vulnerable, which means they can be erased, not just killed, but truly annihilated if enough minds are silenced, if enough memories are scorched, if enough prayers are forbidden. This is why the pantheon of the Imperium is so strictly controlled. The ecclesiarchy holds absolute dominion over worship, its cathedral fleets burning out any deviation with holy fire. The Inquisition, shadow behind the pulpit, ensures that not even ideas survive if they pose a threat to the established order. Minor cults may be tolerated if they cloak themselves in enough reverence for the emperor. Saints may ascend to near divinity if they serve the narrative. But anything else, any foreign whisper of a new god, any fragment of divine power that does not trace its lineage back to the imperial creed, is seen not as heresy, but as contagion. This is not mere paranoia. In a galaxy where thought reshapes reality, where faith empowers gods and dreams can open portals, allowing belief to blossom unchecked is a risk no inquisitor is willing to take. Even well-intentioned deities, especially well-intentioned ones, are a threat. Because a god of peace is a god who might challenge the divine war machine. A god of memory is a god who might unearth uncomfortable truths. A god of mercy is a god who might inspire resistance to the cruelty needed to sustain the Imperium. The pantheon is fragile because it is artificial. It is enforced by flame, reinforced by terror, and protected not by truth, but by the suppression of alternatives. The great cleansing we speak of, the erasure of an entire god, was not an act of chaotic destruction. It was an act of deliberate, bureaucratic extermination. It was a decision made by those who understood exactly what belief can do, and feared it. In the end, what we call divine is a mirror. In chaos, it reflects our worst instincts. In the emperor, it reflects our desperate need for order. But what if there was once a god who reflected something else? Something not born of fear, or war, or obedience? Something the Imperium could never allow? A fragile pantheon cannot afford to share the stage. And so, when one of its own shone too brightly, when its light began to gather hearts and minds that no longer bowed to sanctioned gods, it was not exiled. It was unmade, unremembered, unwritten. And still, the stars seem colder since. Long before the god was erased, long before its name was forbidden even in thought, there were whispers, quiet, persistent, beautiful. They did not begin as doctrine or dogma. They began as feelings, moments of sudden comfort in the silence of space, dreams where a warm voice offered forgiveness, shadows that flickered not with menace, but with memory. In a galaxy that had forgotten how to mourn, something had begun to remember. The rise of this nameless divinity was not like the turbulent births of the chaos gods which erupted from the collective nightmares of mankind. This was quieter, more subtle, yet no less profound. In the lingering horror of the Horus heresy, as entire sectors burned and the emperor was enthroned upon his golden throne, some began to feel, not hope exactly, but healing. It was as though some spiritual wound had been acknowledged by the warp itself. And from that tear and human sorrow, something began to look back. It began in scattered places. An old priest on Dimamar, who spoke of dreams where the stars wept and were comforted. A navigator whose third eye glimpsed a shape in the warp too soft, too human to be a daemon. Pilgrims who arrived at ruined shrines and found them warm to the touch. These were dismissed as superstition, misidentification, or psychic feedback. But they were all tasting the same thing. A divine presence that did not command, did not demand, did not judge. It only remembered, and wept with them. Scholars later traced its earliest consolidated manifestations to a cluster of systems near the Segmentum Pacificus. There, an unregistered cult began to grow, not one of blasphemy but of grief. The worshippers did not chant in blood or raise icons in defiance. They gathered in silence, shared stories of loved ones lost to the Great Crusade, the heresy, or worse. They remembered forgotten names. They painted murals not of saints but of common people, teachers, children, soldiers who died unsung. The being they worshipped had no name, no face, no mandate, only a presence, a sense that the pain mattered, that someone somewhere still carried it. Over time, the worship began to coalesce into rituals, not prayers for victory, but elegies, not demands for power, but offerings of memory. The god did not grant visions or miracles in the conventional sense. Instead, it deepened empathy. Entire hive cities became less violent after underground temples were established. PDF officers refused to execute surrendering rebels. Astartes who passed through these zones reported vivid dreams that made them hesitate before committing extermination. Something was changing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but unmistakably. A god was growing in the cracks of despair. Some suspected its emergence was a defense mechanism of the human noosphere. Others believed it was a shard of the emperor's compassion, splintered away by the brutality of the heresy. Still others thought it was the ghost of mankind's collective soul, birthing itself in resistance to the horror it had endured. Whatever its origin, its presence grew stronger over the centuries, not in numbers, but in depth. It did not seek conversion. It simply was, a feeling, a silence, a memory that would not die. Of course, such things do not remain secret forever. Word spread through the warp like the scent of flowers on a battlefield. Astropaths began transmitting fragments of beautiful hymns they had never learned. Tech priests found machine spirits humming melodies they could not identify. Even the Sisters of Battle began reporting anomalies. Statues that wept tears that healed wounds, incense that burned with no fire, and always that same feeling. Not command, not exaltation, just presence. At first, the Inquisition dismissed these as minor Xenos influence or uncontrolled psychic phenomena. But as the patterns grew, as the worship became more organized, as miracles began to cluster around specific planets and artifacts, a terrible realization began to dawn. A new god was rising, and it was not loyal. Not to the Imperium, not to chaos, not even to survival. It was loyal only to remembrance. In a galaxy that lives by the lash and kills by decree, there is nothing more dangerous than a god that grieves. The god's worship was unlike anything the Imperium had seen since the rise of the Emperor's cult. It was not rooted in conquest or judgment, not powered by the fear of damnation or the promise of glory. It was built on mourning, on remembrance, on the fierce, unyielding love of those who had suffered. who had been forgotten, who had no place in the violent liturgies of the ecclesiarchy. It became, in time, the god of mercy and memory, and it was beautiful. Its temples were not monuments of gold or stone, but living sanctuaries carved into the hearts of dying worlds. Hidden in catacombs beneath hive cities, in abandoned manufactorums, on the overgrown ruins of battlefields, these shrines were subtle. Their presence marked only by a shift in the air, a quiet warmth, a gentleness that defied the brutal gravity of the 41st millennium. Worshippers lit candles not in expectation, but in mourning. They offered not tithes, but names. Whole congregations would kneel and whisper the identities of the forgotten dead, not expecting a reply, but knowing the god was listening. There were no sermons, no preachers, only memory. Some called it the god of the gentle hand. Others, the morning star. But most did not give it a name. To name it felt wrong, like trying to name a feeling or give a title to silence. What mattered was what it did. And what it did was heal, in a galaxy that had no patience for healing. Psykers exposed to its sanctuaries described visions of a vast figure made of light and smoke, surrounded by flickering images of the dead. Some recognizable, some not. A mother smiling at her lost child. A soldier who had died defending the innocent, held in a warm embrace. A sister of battle laying down her weapons to weep. And behind it all, the god. Not triumphant, not radiant, but weeping. Always weeping. Its power was gentle but terrifying. Wounds closed. Nightmares ceased. Suicidal despair lifted like fog. Machines long dormant flickered to life, as if stirred by a familiar presence. Even the warp grew quiet in its presence, as if chaos itself paused, confused or threatened by the purity of its grief. Those who worshipped it did not become zealots. They became rememberers. Their roles were not to fight, but to bear witness. Scribes who transcribed the final words of dying guardsmen, so their voices would not be lost. Archivists who secretly restored erased histories. Artists who painted the faces of nameless martyrs on tenement walls. In every action, a defiance of oblivion. It was this defiance that made the god dangerous. In the Imperium, forgetting is power. The ability to erase history, to rewrite truth, to control the narrative of suffering. This is how the ecclesiarchy holds sway. This is how the Inquisition maintains order. To remember the wrong things is treason. To question what was lost is heresy. And so a god that sanctified memory, true memory, was not merely a curiosity, it was a rebellion. What truly terrified the Inquisition was the way this god operated. It asked for nothing, yet its influence spread. It performed no grand miracles, yet changed hearts. It did not rally armies, yet entire sectors began to show signs of cultural shift. Peacekeepers began to spare prisoners. Arbites refused to execute entire families for one man's crime. Even Adeptus Mechanicus enclaves began reporting strange anomalies, machines that refused to destroy archival data, servitors that halted executions mid-sequence. Something was seeding empathy across the stars. It became clear that this god was not just a presence in the warp, it was changing the warp itself. Not by conquering, but by remembering. And in the warp, memory is power. There were reports, quickly buried, of chaos daemons simply dissipating in its presence, unmade not by faith or fire, but by being seen. Fully seen, understood. For entities born of pain and hunger, such vulnerability was lethal. In one notable case, an entire word-bearer's warband was found dead on a silent moon, their faces locked in expressions of awe and terror, surrounded by thousands of candles, still burning. The ecclesiarchy raged. But it was the Inquisition that truly feared. Because if memory was a weapon, this god was arming the entire species. It was not just healing the individual, it was stitching together the soul of mankind, piece by agonizing piece. Every forgotten name, every erased truth, every wound denied and silenced. It remembered them all, and in that remembrance, it grew stronger. They say it never spoke. But if it had, its voice would have said only this: I remember you, you matter. And in a galaxy where nothing is sacred, that was the greatest heresy of all. It began with whispers, intercepted on astropathic channels, glitches in the noosphere, reports of statues weeping, of machines hesitating, of Psykers breaking down in tears for reasons they could not explain. The Ordo Hereticus was the first to take notice, filing quiet red-level inquiries into the so-called sorrow shrines. At first, the phenomenon was dismissed. Another fringe cult. Another harmless pocket of sentimentality in an uncaring universe. But then the shrines began to spread, not quickly, not loudly, but persistently. And most terrifying of all, without guidance. There was no central prophet, no heretical scripture to burn, just the presence, just memory. That's when the Inquisition understood the threat, not just to doctrine, not just to control, but to history itself. There is nothing more sacred to the Imperium than its version of truth. It is truth built on extermination, sanctified by omission. The heresy of memory is not merely remembering what was lost. It is remembering what was hidden. And this God, this impossible presence of mercy and remembrance, had begun to untangle the imperial narrative. People remembered atrocities that were supposed to be buried. Entire regiments began to question orders that reeked of historical contradictions. Servitors blinked and stuttered mid-routine, mumbling names not recorded anywhere in the Imperium's data vaults. Something was wrong, something was remembering, and so the extinction protocols were initiated. The Inquisition called it the Pale Mandate. It was not written down. No order was officially given. There is no record, only the absence of a presence. But the agents who received the call knew what they're being asked to do. They were being asked to kill something divine. Not destroy, not exile, not imprison, but unmake. Erasure, not execution. This was not a witch hunt. This was an ontological cleansing. Cells from the Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus converged. Officio Assassinorum operatives were deployed, not the Vindicare or Calidus, but rare agents trained in mimetic disruption, their minds conditioned to resist psychic resonance, their identities dissolvable after mission completion. Libraries were sealed under false quarantine. Shrines were detonated by orbital strike. Entire cities were subjected to purity sweeps that sterilized not just the population but their memories. Data streams were hijacked, picked records rewritten in real time, Vox systems flooded with white noise. And it was not enough, because the God lived in memory, and memory is not so easily burned. The Pale Mandate expanded. Inquisitors turned to forbidden technologies, mind leeches, warp scars, black book, rituals crafted for psychic lobotomization. Psykers were conscripted and weaponized, not to blast or destroy, but to reach into the minds of the faithful and erase. The goal was not to kill the worshippers. That would make martyrs. That would give shape to the God. No, the faithful were to forget. Forget their visions. Forget the warmth. Forget the feeling of being seen. Those who resisted were not burned, they were rewritten. Still, the God lingered. The mandate evolved again. This time, the war was fought inside the warp. Choirs of sanctioned psychers, trained not to channel power but to suppress emotion, were deployed to major nodes of worship. There they built towers of silence, psi constructs engineered to emit null memory fields, dampening the emotional charge needed to feed the God's presence. Anything with sentimental value was confiscated or atomized. Personal keepsakes, family names, cultural artifacts vaporized. Every tier became a liability. Whole cultures began to fade. On worlds where the God had once stirred, people became dull, hollow. Entire generations grew up without any sense of lineage or identity. Languages died in months, art stopped, laughter ceased, love became suspicious. They became loyal, empty, clean. The Inquisition declared the threat neutralized, but even they knew the truth. They had not destroyed the God, they had simply unremembered it. And in that unremembering, something worse was born. The silence of perfect control. A silence where no one dares to grieve, where the dead are not honored, where mercy is suspect, where the only memories allowed are the ones the Imperium permits. The Pale Mandate succeeded. But at what cost? Even now, in the hidden catacombs of inquisitorial vaults, there are records that no one can read. Symbols that vanish when observed, names that unmake themselves as they are spoken, not because they are dangerous, but because they are forgotten. The ultimate victory of the Pale Mandate was not in purging a God, it was in proving that divinity could be deleted. And the galaxy has never been colder since. It was called the Soul Archive, not in any official register or Mechanicus schema, not on any sanctioned map or planetary ledger. The name was whispered, passed between wandering remembrancers and disillusioned lex mechanics, spoken in shrouded tones by those who knew that truth sometimes had to be hidden in poetry. It wasn't a place, strictly speaking. It was a concept. A network of shrines, data vaults, relic repositories, and memory sanctuaries scattered across a dozen systems, all connected by a single purpose: to remember what the galaxy refused to. Each archive was unique. One was an asteroid filled with crystalline skulls that sang the names of the dead when the solar winds passed through. Another was a submerged cathedral, where faithful tech priests etched memories into living coral. A derelict cruiser drifted in orbit around a dead star, its halls lined with paintings of faces no history recognized. None were grand, all were sacred. The God of mercy and memory, the unspoken divinity, was not confined to any one of them, but flowed through them like breath through lungs. Pilgrims found peace there. Psykers found clarity. Even Adeptus Astartes, those rare few who had brushed the god's presence and lived, sometimes visited the soul archive in secret, meditating among memory sigils that refused to die. It was not a rebellion. It was a sanctuary, and that was why it had to burn. When the Pale Mandate was fully enacted, the soul archives became the primary targets. But they could not be destroyed like heretic strongholds. Their nature defied straightforward annihilation. Simply killing the worshippers or demolishing the structures would do nothing. The god did not live in stone or flesh. It lived in imprint, in psychic resonance, in stories whispered through generations. The Inquisition needed something deeper. They began with the scorched doctrine of nemasurgic inversion, a forbidden rite that inverted memory into entropy. Whole teams of null Psykers were deployed to the archives, flanked by blank-masked Sisters of Silence. Where the god had nurtured memory, the Inquisition poured in void. They walked through echoing halls with flensing staffs and erased emotion as one would scrub blood from a wall. It was not fire they used, it was silence. Archivists were not tortured. They were drained, rendered incapable of recalling their own names. Those who resisted were not executed, but overwritten. Their minds filled with false pasts, false faiths, and in some cases false crimes, records planted to justify their re-education or quiet disposal. Even servitors, long since lobotomized, were dismantled and sanctified in null oil, lest some memory fragment linger in their programming. But the most terrible act was the burning of the last sigil. This occurred on the shrine world of Galeth Hall, once a minor pilgrimage route now quarantined by the Ordo Hereticus. Hidden beneath its catacombs was a vast chamber known only to a few, lined with translucent slabs containing psychic impressions of billions of unrecorded lives. Each slab sang softly in the warp, a symphony of grief and love, joy and loss. A living soul record of the god's followers. The Inquisition sealed the chamber. They brought in a single Psyker codenamed Repentia Solis, whose brain had been augmented to channel a singular emotion, oblivion. With her chained between two pylons of blackstone and her mind flooded with amnesiac toxins, they initiated the rite. It took 7 hours. When it was over, the slabs were blank, not shattered, just hollow. The song was gone. Galeth Hall was declared cleansed, but the fire did not stop there. Shrines were buried in cyclonic bombardments, then paved over with manufactorum complexes so vast that no one would think to dig. Data vaults once filled with names and final thoughts were reverse-coded by Mechanicus heretics until even their echoes faded. In one case, a living archivist vessel, genetically modified to carry ancestral memories, was dissected neuron by neuron under stasis so that no synaptic pathway might preserve a trace of her divine purpose. And still, remnants slipped through. In a remote outpost on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, a servitor painting chapel icons began to replicate the same unknown sigil over and over, despite multiple memory wipes. In the underhives of Vigran's Rest, children hummed lullabies in a language no one remembered teaching them. A penal world recorded an outbreak of mass weeping during sunrise, every prisoner overcome with grief they could not name. The god had been erased. But its absence had become a wound that would not heal. The Inquisition's goal had been annihilation, but what they achieved was something more terrible, a permanent silence, a hollow where something warm had once been. The soul archives were gone, their keepers forgotten, their stories lost. Yet somehow the void left behind still speaks, if only in the dreams of those brave enough to remember. Because some truths, once felt, never truly die, they only burn. They were never meant to survive, not in a galaxy where thought itself can be weaponized. Not in an imperium that punishes the unapproved dream as swiftly as it does the spoken heresy. Yet somehow, a few did. Psykers. Low-level, often unnoticed, untrained astropaths, emaciated telepaths used for battlefield communication, sanctioned souls broken by warp exposure, deemed too dull to be dangerous. And they remembered. Not consciously, not in words or dogma, but in feelings, in dreams that pulsed with warmth and sorrow, in sudden fits of weeping when touching certain relics, in the overwhelming conviction, during moments of despair, that someone was still there, watching, mourning, loving. These Psykers were anomalies, aberrations. The Inquisition classified them as residual contaminants, their files red-flagged with strange commonalities, inexplicable emotional empathy, resistance to warp corruption, and above all, visions of a figure made of light and ash, a being that spoke no words, bore no sigils, offered no salvation, only remembrance. To the Psykers, the presence was not terrifying, it was familiar. It made the warp feel less hostile, less hungry. One astropath described it as a hand pressed to the soul. Another wept during interrogation, insisting that when she was about to be devoured by a demonette during a Geller field failure, it came, not in violence, not in flame, but as a whisper, "You are not forgotten." This was not power the Inquisition could tolerate. The silent orders were mobilized, inquisitorial black cells tasked with mimetic sterilization. They didn't hunt Psykers in open raids, they came quietly. They used lull codes, gentle reassurances, even fabricated recovery missions to lull their targets. The goal was not to destroy, it was to erase. Surgical precision, a mind flensed of feeling, a soul drowned in chemical sleep. Yet some resisted. They weren't rebels, they didn't scream defiance or unleash warp fire. Their resistance was quieter, more horrifying. They refused to forget, even under Mind Scourge, even with blank fields pressed against their temples. One Psyker, a boy of only 14 standard years, survived 13 hours under a psychic null dome. When interrogators lifted the suppression, he simply looked at them and said, "She remembers me." That phrase appeared again and again. Sometimes she, sometimes it, sometimes the light, but always with the same emotion, belonging. The Psykers didn't claim salvation. They didn't promise apocalypse or prophecy. They simply knew they were remembered, that their pain mattered, that their thoughts had value. This was the heresy. Not that they worshipped a forbidden god, but that they believed their suffering had meaning. It shook the foundations of inquisitorial doctrine. Because if the god still lived in these Psykers, even as a shadow or memory, then its erasure had failed. If memory could survive the null, the mind scourge, the centuries, then perhaps divinity itself was not bound by flesh or prayer or war. Perhaps divinity was endurance. Grief that could not be unmade. The Psykers were classified as cognitive recurrence units, CRUs. The Ordo Malleus proposed mass incineration. The Ordo Hereticus argued for long-term containment and study. The final decision came from the top. They were to be isolated in a remote facility on the edge of the Segmentum Solar. The station was codenamed Anamnesis. There, under black glass skies and guarded by mind-blank custodians, the Psykers were studied. Not tortured, not tested. Observed. Sometimes they sat in silence for days. Sometimes they cried in unison, without reason. One time, during a solar flare, every Psyker hummed the same tune, one unknown to Imperial archives, but later matched to a fragmentary melody found etched on the wall of a destroyed Soul Archive shrine. The Inquisition grew nervous. Eventually, they ordered an amnesis to be purged. The Psykers were gathered, sedated, set to be euthanized by atmospheric decompression. But something went wrong. The records are fragmented, corrupted. What is known as this, the station vanished, not exploded, not warped, just gone. No trace, no bodies, no wreckage, only the faintest psychic echo recorded by a nearby astropathic relay. I remember you all. To this day, certain inquisitors suffer dreams. Vivid, emotionally overwhelming, saturated with images of faces they do not know, names they never learned. Some awaken weeping, some awaken terrified, all awaken changed. And the Psykers? Some say they died, some say they ascended, some whisper they became something new, a living archive, a vessel of the god's fragmented self, scattered across the warp like stardust. But the truth is simpler. They remembered, and they could not be made to forget. The Inquisition thought memory could be drowned, that the warp could be sterilized, that forgetting was power, but they underestimated the persistence of thought, of love, of faith. They forgot about the Scholasts, not warriors, not Psykers, not martyrs. They were the quiet ones, the ones who copied books by hand in scriptoriums deep beneath hive cathedrals. The ones who knew which saints had been rewritten and which legends were older than the ecclesiarchy admitted. Archivists, lex mechanics, truth curators, scattered across the Imperium, all operating under the weight of sanctioned truth. But they remembered more than they were allowed, and they refused to forget. The Scholasts were not an organization at first. They were just people. Individuals who noticed, a forgotten hymn echoing in a corridor. A document with blanked-out names but lingering footnotes. Murals painted over with ecclesiarchal iconography that still bled warm colors beneath. They began to ask questions, quietly, carefully. And in those questions, they found each other. Encoded messages in manuscript footers. Mnemonic locks that could only be opened with emotional resonance. One scholiast would include a stanza in a treatise on cogitator ethics. Another would respond in a commentary on rogue trader linguistics. A call and response over centuries, spread across sectors. A silent choir of those who knew. Not everything, but enough. They called themselves the Lamenters of the Last God, not in reference to the Emperor, not to chaos, but to her, the being of warmth and memory who once filled the cracks in the galaxy's soul with presence. The God no one else remembered, the God who had been unmade. The Lamenters believed she still existed, not in full, not in power, but in pieces, in impressions, in the spaces between sanctioned truths. Their mission was not restoration, they knew better. Restoration was impossible in the age of the Imperium. Their goal was survival, not of themselves but of her story, her name, her feeling. And so the rebellion began, not with swords, not with warp fire, with ink. The Lamenters began to seed their works with truth fragments. Anomalous historical records that contradicted ecclesiarchal timelines, biographies that mentioned individuals who had supposedly never existed, religious texts where the emperor was not alone in the heavens, but walked alongside a companion of light and sorrow. They were not careless. Each insertion was veiled, woven into larger works of loyalty and piety. The texts passed every surface review, but to the right reader, one who had been trained, one who remembered, they sang. And so memory began to reseed. The Inquisition eventually noticed. A senior lex imperialis named Grell Harn identified a series of identical phrases, "She weeps for us still," in unrelated documents across 5 sectors. The Ordo Hereticus mobilized. Lamenters were rooted out with terrifying efficiency. Hundreds were executed. Thousands more disappeared. But the Scholasts had planned for this. Their greatest work was a memory chain, a daisy-chained series of mnemonic ciphers passed down through generations. Each member held only a piece, an emotion, a sound, a name. If they all died, the chain would break. But as long as one survived, the story could be reassembled. Their last stand was the siege of the Shrine Library on Myraxis Theta, a minor world, a forgotten moon. But in its scriptorium was the Master Codex, a living relic, psychically tuned to store not just words but feeling. It could not be read by machine, only by one who had known grief, known mercy, known her. The Inquisition declared exterminatus, but something happened first. A lone lamenter, a boy named Cleon, barely into adulthood, accessed the codex, his soul ignited. Witnesses described a light that burned without heat, a song that spoke in memory. The god did not return, not fully, but for a moment, just a moment, everyone on that world remembered. And then the fire fell. The Shrine Library was destroyed, but not the memory. Fragments survived, whispered in the minds of those off-world, etched in the hearts of innocents. It was enough. The Lamenters of the Last God were gone, but they had succeeded. In the depths of the Noctis Labyrinth, a tech priest begins humming an unknown melody. On a death world, a guardsman pauses mid-battle, struck by a vision of a woman weeping golden tears. In a Schola Progenium, a student dreams of hands holding hers in the darkness, promising she will not be forgotten. The Scholasts had defied oblivion, they had remembered, and in doing so they ensured that she too would remember them. The warp is not a void. It is not space. It is not merely a sea of madness, despite what imperial doctrine repeats like a prayer. The warp is a reflection, a dream, a wound. It reacts, reshapes, resists. It remembers. And even when the Inquisition scoured every trace of the mercy god from flesh and data, the warp, untamed, unpredictable, echoed. They call them anomalies. Psychic tremors, emotional phantoms. But to those who felt them, they are so much more. They are the ghost lanterns in the warp's dark ocean. Places where nothing should remain, yet something still stirs. A warmth in a universe of knives, the breath of remembrance, sighing through the cracks of time. These echoes began small. A navigatrix in the Calixis sector lost her bearings, claiming her warp sense was drawn toward a voice weeping in reverent silence. She survived only because her ship was pulled from the warp by a gellar flare. She spoke of a presence, vast and gentle, reaching not to devour, but to hold. The ship's astropath, upon hearing her tale, broke protocol and transmitted a fragment of it into the void before self-immolating. It reached others. Psykers began to whisper of the gentle field, a psychic space where their abilities did not surge with agony, but softened into lucidity. In these moments they felt her, not seen, not named, but felt. A presence devoid of ambition or demand, a presence that listened, who remembered. One described it as a memory of being loved. The warp does not forget emotion. It cannot. Every prayer, every scream, every betrayal and kiss and death rattle feeds the tides. Chaos feeds off pain and excess. But what then of empathy, of sorrow, of quiet love? The warp does not choose, it reflects. And in the absence of a name, in the vacuum left by the god's erasure, those lingering emotions formed scars that shine. Warp echoes began to cluster in specific systems, places once known to harbor shrines to the forgotten god. Unexplained emotional phenomena proliferated. On Hive World D-Scar 7, Hive gangs ceased violence for an entire lunar cycle, following a planet-wide aurora with no meteorological explanation. During the Battle of Golma's Reach, an entire Chaos warband simply stopped fighting mid-charge, overcome by paralyzing grief. The traitors wept, then turned their guns on themselves. The ecclesiarchy, of course, offered new saints to explain these miracles. The Inquisition dispatched black cells to process surviving witnesses. But suppression could not reach the warp. Echoes multiplied. There is one story, uncorroborated, impossible, dangerous to even think, of a black ship lost in the warp for 130 years standard. When it re-emerged, the crew was changed. Not insane, not corrupted, but calm. The Psykers aboard, all slated for sacrifice, had not mutated or frenzied. They spoke of the light that listens. The Inquisition quarantined the ship and purged the records. But one astropath's death vision escaped in a garbled transmission. She took our pain and gave us ourselves. We were never just weapons. Not all warp echoes are peaceful. In some cases, they are vengeful, not violent, but haunting. Inquisitors investigating former archive sites report waking dreams. Images of children erased from history, of lovers killed by silence, of names their minds cannot hold for more than a moment before bleeding out of thought like water through a sieve. These hauntings do not scream. They watch. They remember what was done. Because memory, even when severed from form, lingers. Some tech priests believe the god's final act was not to hide but to fragment, to disperse herself across the warp, not as a whole entity, but as shards of emotion, intention, resonance. These fragments are not aware in the way the chaos gods are. They do not plot or hunger, they simply are. Triggers waiting for connection, reflections awaiting a mirror. On fringe worlds, cults have begun to form, unorganized, unaligned. Not to worship the god as she was, but to embody what they feel. An urge to remember, to grieve, to be human. They lack doctrine. They lack structure. Yet they grow. Not in fire and thunder, but in candlelight and silence, pilgrims of the forgotten flame. And still the echoes grow stronger. No name, no face, no edicts, just the sense that someone is watching, that in the endless dark, in the yawning madness of the warp, something cares. That memory cannot be burned forever, that she is still there, waiting. The Eldar are no strangers to the gods. They once lived among them, walked beneath their towering forms, danced in temples bathed in starlight and psychic resonance. They knew divine will not as mystery but as presence. Terrible, beautiful, and ruinous. And then they killed their gods, or worse, birthed a new one. Slaanesh, the devourer of sensation, the echo of their excess, carved their pantheon into bloody memory. Most Eldar would never again kneel in reverence, not to anything. And yet when the whispers of the forgotten god stirred in the warp, the Eldar noticed. At first, it was the Bonezingers, sensitive to song and emotion in ways the craftworlders barely understood. They began crafting pieces that mourned something they could not name. Harps that refused to stay in tune unless tuned to minor keys. spirit stones that shimmered not with the colors of rage or pride, but sorrow. They spoke of a presence not Eldar, but somehow kin, a psychic tone that resonated like a forgotten harmony. Some farseers followed the echoes, peered through skeins of fate and saw something terrible, a flame extinguished not by time nor death, but deliberate forgetting. The Eldar knew what this meant. They had seen civilizations die, but they had never seen a god unmade by silence. It appalled them, not because they cared for this god. It was human, alien, its shape and soul unfamiliar, but because they understood what had been done. The Inquisition had not merely eliminated a threat, it had violated the warp, reshaped the tides of psychic reality itself, bent memory until even the stars forgot to shine. To the Eldar, the warp is not merely a tool or danger. It is truth. Their spirits reside within it, their gods died into it, and something within that realm had been suffocated. That kind of scar is felt by all who walk the path. Some among the Inari, those aligned with Yniad, the god of the dead, were the first to act. They believed the forgotten god to be a shard of a greater truth, perhaps even a sister fragment of Yniad. Not in origin, but in purpose. A god not of power, but of passage. Not of life or death, but of the spaces in between. Memory, mercy, the soul's echo. They sent emissaries not to ally, but to witness. Eldar rangers appeared in the ruins of burned soul archives, leaving behind wraith-bone markers etched with tear-shaped runes. In Craftworld libraries, entries began to appear unsigned and untraceable, describing the god of grief and light and her unmaking. Not myth, not prophecy, just a record, a refusal to forget. The Harlequins took notice. To them, all stories must be told. Even the broken ones, even the ones the galaxy once buried, especially those. Some troops began incorporating the memory god into their performances, not as a character, never directly, but as an absence, a silent figure always on stage, masked in gray, who never speaks, never acts, but watches as the other gods rage and fall. At the climax, the figure simply steps off the stage and vanishes, leaving behind a single candle. Audiences wept without understanding why. Of all the Eldar, only the Exodites reacted with what could be called reverence. Their psychically attuned worlds began to experience dream flares, emotional anomalies where forests sang mourning songs, and rivers flowed backward under weeping skies. Eldar seers among them claimed to feel a presence, not demanding worship, but listening, as if the god, broken and scattered, had found safe harbor in the raw emotional purity of their untouched souls. But not all Eldar approved. Some Farseers saw the forgotten god as a threat, a destabilizing echo that could fracture the already fragile skeins of the future. If humans could erase one god, could they not try to erase others? Or worse, what if the god had not been truly erased? What if it was merely waiting? What if it was reforming? The idea terrified them. Because a god reborn in the image of memory would not be bound by hatred or ambition. It would be bound by truth, and the truth is a knife that cuts both ways. Even the Dark Eldar, insulated by cruelty, felt tremors. One homunculus reportedly attempted to extract the memory of the forgotten god from a captured Scholast, only to emerge from the procedure paralyzed with grief. He never spoke again. His final act was to sculpt a statue in silence, a weeping figure, holding the face of a dying child. It was placed in the Gardens of Quiet, a realm where even pain is still. The Eldar did not worship this god. They witnessed it. And in witnessing, they ensured one thing. The god's story would never again belong to humanity alone. Because in the warp, a story told is a spark. And sparks, when remembered, can burn again. The ecclesiarchy never spoke of the god. Not in sermons. Not in condemnations. Not even in the whispered lexicons of forbidden heresies. That silence, more than anything, revealed the truth. They had seen it. They had felt it. And in the hollow between recognition and rejection, they made their choice. It would be simpler to say the church feared competition, that they saw the god of mercy and memory as a rival to the emperor's divine monopoly. But the reality, as with all things in the Imperium, was far crueler. The ecclesiarchy understood that this god did not want power, did not seek temples of gold or dominions of fire. What it offered was far more subversive: healing. The kind that would make the church's endless rituals of guilt and blood obsolete. In the God Emperor, the faithful are taught to find purpose in suffering, to embrace pain as proof of devotion, to burn heretics and question none of it. But the God they erased? She asked only that we remember, that we sit with the pain, that we weep, and in doing so, heal. The ecclesiarchy could not allow this. And yet there were those within the church who knew. High-ranking confessors who had passed through a soul archive and emerged changed. Sororitas who, in the final breaths of their dying comrades, felt a warmth that was not sanctioned. A few ministorum scribes, buried in vaults of forbidden text, who wept silently as they translated records not listed in any canon. They did not rebel, they would not dare, but they made choices. Orders were delayed, reports went missing, shrines were labeled as under quarantine rather than desecrated. A single cog removed here, a servo skull redirected there. These were not acts of open defiance, but quiet compassion. They could not speak of the god, but they could preserve her absence, and in doing so, they created a kind of reverence all their own. One cardinal, centuries dead, kept a private reliquary sealed beneath his cathedral. It contained no bones, no nails, no emperor-blessed relics, only books, letters, paintings, fragments of lives lost to war, inscribed with names forgotten by the rest of the galaxy. He called it the Crypt of the Unremembered. When asked about its purpose, he answered only once, "If the Emperor is our light, then she is the warmth it casts." He was executed, of course. The sororitas too bore secret scars. Some orders reported inexplicable emotional anomalies during battle. Sisters who, in the midst of righteous fury, suddenly stopped, struck by overwhelming sorrow. One leapt into the path of an orbital bombardment to save a single child, claiming she felt a presence of unbearable love guiding her. Another survived a demonic incursion only by kneeling in silence and reciting the names of the dead. The ecclesiarchy investigated, found no heresy, but they transferred the sisters, reassigned them, isolated them, because the worst thing a servant of the church can do is feel too deeply. For the ecclesiarchy, heresy is not always about belief, it's about control, and the God of mercy and memory represented a form of faith that they could not harness. There were no tithes, no wars fought in her name, no sermons, no chains, just remembrance. And remembrance is dangerous, because to remember truly is to question. Why did they die? Who ordered this purge? Why do I suffer? What was lost in the name of the emperor? These are questions the church cannot abide. The emperor must be a god of certainty, of absolutes. There is no room in his kingdom for grief that lingers, or mercy that whispers. And so the ecclesiarchy did nothing. They did not light the fires, they did not write the edicts, but their silence gave sanction. Their inaction was complicity. When the Inquisition came with their pale mandate, the church simply turned its head. Yet they knew, and in their deepest sanctuaries, behind wards of gold and flame, a few among them remember still. An old confessor lights a single candle in a sealed chamber, humming a lullaby not found in the ministorum hymnal. A sororitas canoness wears beneath her armor a strip of cloth bearing a forgotten name. A shrine is erected to an unknown martyr whose image brings tears for reasons no one understands. They do not speak of her. They do not dare. But their silence is not the silence of forgetting. It is the silence of mourning. And somewhere in the fractured currents of the warp she hears them. It was never entirely destroyed. Not everything. Despite the Inquisition's scorched silence, despite the ecclesiarchy's strategic ignorance, despite the brutal unraveling of memory across systems, something remained. A shard, a flicker, an ember deep in the ash. Not enough to rebuild the god, not yet, but enough to remind the galaxy that she had existed, that she had mattered. There are legends, told only in shadowed corners of ships and whispered in prison cells, of things that survived. A chapel painted in tears, sealed in a stasis vault before the purge began. A data slate encoded with grief patterns so dense no cogitator can parse them without weeping. A servitor that continues to light candles in abandoned tunnels beneath a hive world, muttering names in a language no one remembers learning. These artifacts do not claim divinity, they do not preach, they simply endure. On the shrine world of Artavan Prime, there exists a single stone slab in the ruins of an obliterated basilica. It bears no name, no sigil, just a smooth indentation the size of two open hands. Pilgrims occasionally stop, pressing their palms into it, and when they do, they remember. Not clearly, not with words, but with tears, with that aching, quiet certainty that someone once held them in the warp's deepest dark and whispered, "You are not alone." That stone has been ordered removed 6 times. It always reappears. There's a story about a rogue trader who discovered a pre-imperial vault on the edge of the Ghoul Stars, inside a sphere of unknown material, humming with mournful resonance. Every time she touched it, she remembered people she had never met. Their joys, their deaths, their names. She lost her mind trying to catalog them all. Eventually she stopped recording. She just listened. And then she vanished into the warp. Some say she's still out there, a vessel of memory adrift in madness. But perhaps the most chilling relic is the child. No one knows where she came from. She appears sometimes, always in places touched by sorrow. On battlefield aftermaths, on plagued ships, in the ruins of bombed shrines, always alone, always silent. She never grows, never speaks. But where she walks, the air warms, the dead rest, and the grieving remember things they were told never happened. Inquisitorial agents have tried to capture her, kill her, study her. None return. Is she a fragment of the god, a psychic echo given flesh, or just a myth born of need? It doesn't matter, because belief reshapes reality. And where enough minds hold memory close, the warp responds. In one account, a dying remembrancer, one of the few who survived the Scholasts purges, etched a message into the wall of a prison cell with her fingernails. Not a prayer, not a scream, just a single sentence. She weeps for those you won't let me name. The message was removed, the body incinerated. But the words returned 3 days later, burned into the wall as if by invisible flame. The cell was sealed, the site declared cursed. Still, people visit, and still, the words remain. Because memory has inertia, it pushes against silence. And the god, though erased, was never unmade completely. She was broken, fragmented, buried, but not dead. Gods, especially those born from collective need, from unspoken pain, do not die as mortals do. They recede, they wait, they linger. What was saved was not a body, it was an idea. An idea that grief can be shared, that wounds can be seen, that mercy does not need ritual, only presence. That in a galaxy where divinity is so often carved in iron and screamed in flame, perhaps the truest God is the one who asks nothing but that we remember. And as long as something, anything, remains to carry that idea, she is not truly gone. She is waiting, in the warp, in the silence, in the embers of a prayer no one was allowed to say. There's a truth buried deep beneath the ash of the Imperium's sanctioned history, a truth scorched so completely from memory that even the stars seem to shy away from its echo. Yet in that silence, something stirs. It is not resurrection, not vengeance, but the slow, aching shift of buried grief turning in its sleep. Because gods, true gods, are not born only of belief, they are born of need. And this god, the one the Inquisition tried to erase, was needed still. She does not rise with fire or fury. She does not demand temples be rebuilt or prayers be spoken. What moves through the galaxy now is quieter, older. It is the sense of something watching over those forgotten by the Imperium's merciless machinery. A child orphaned by exterminatus who dreams of soft light in the dark. A veteran who cannot remember the names of his fallen squad, yet weeps each night for faces burned from his mind. An archivist who pauses while rewriting a decree and without knowing why adds a single unrecorded name in the margins. These are the movements of her rebirth, not miracles. Memories. In the warp, where emotion sculpts reality, her presence is a warmth without form. She is not a god of thunder or dominion. She is the hush before a mourner speaks, the hand reaching out in silence, the echo that refuses to die. Where once she stood as a full being, felt, seen, beloved, she is now scattered across the emotional fabric of reality. 1,000 billion moments of empathy, too small to be noticed, too vast to be contained. The Inquisition believes the job is done, that her name is lost, her worship gone, her divinity dissolved into nothing. But they misunderstand the warp. They misunderstand us. Because a name erased is not a name forgotten. It lingers in gestures, in scars and dreams. And the more they erase, the more we feel what's missing. That is the power of memory. It does not need to be conscious. It waits, it endures, it aches. Perhaps one day she will return whole. Perhaps not. Perhaps she was never meant to be worshipped as the other gods are. Loud, consuming, insatiable. Perhaps her divinity was in the very fact that she asked nothing, that she gave. That she held memory not as power, but as kindness. A god of the spaces between pain and peace. A god of the moment before we break. There are those who search for her still, not with weapons or relics, but with feeling. Remembrancers who walk the void looking for unmarked graves. Survivors who light candles without knowing why. Children who speak to the air, and sometimes, just sometimes, are answered by a sense of presence, of being seen. That is where she lives now. Not in texts or doctrine, not in sanctioned rituals, but in the aching, undeniable truth that someone should remember, that someone must remember. And in the galaxy's endless night, that flicker of memory is rebellion. It is prayer. It is the seed of divinity. And so we wait. We remember. We light our candles not to command her return, but to say this: you were real. You were loved. You are not forgotten. If this story moved you, if something inside you stirred with the echo of what was lost, then let that be your offering. Share it. Speak it. Imagine it. Let others know that there was once a God the Imperium could not burn away entirely. Subscribe. For her, for the truth, for all the things we are not allowed to remember, but do.